But I would like to thank Phil and Carl for being part of our conversation that we're having this afternoon. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to allow each of them to introduce themselves, and then we're going to find out more from them about what they've done to be successful. Phil, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Phil Rosenblum. I am a nonprofit financial consultant based in Poughkeepsie. So I work with a pretty wide range of nonprofits to help them plan for their long-term financial sustainability so that they can continue to serve their communities and pursue their missions over the long term. I also work to some extent with grant-making institutions to incorporate financial due diligence into their grant-making to make sure that their funds are as impactful as possible for the long-term health of their grantees. I have served as board treasurer for both the Poughkeepsie Farm Project as well as for Community Family Development, which is a nonprofit childcare center in Poughkeepsie. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Phil. And Carl?
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carl Cote. I'm currently a CFO consultant. I work with a couple different firms, CFO for Hire, a part of BST based in Albany, as well as Capital CFO Plus. So I work, with a lot of different clients. I've got, many years of experience in not-for-profits, spent my whole career, started out in public accounting, worked for a healthcare system in, various roles. Yep. So I have, a lot of experience doing a lot of different things that not-for-profits have to do to fulfill their mission. So looking forward to speaking with everybody this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Carl. Now, Phil, I'm going to turn it over back to you. And if you could define for us what you think being a successful treasurer means, what does that look like?
Yeah, so, I think that I would ground that a little bit by thinking about the role of the board as a whole in financial oversight, right? And I think that there can sometimes be sort of a misunderstanding that only the treasurer or only members of the finance committee are members of the board responsible for doing financial oversight and keeping their eye on the financial health of the organization. And that's not the case, right? It's really every member of the board has equal fiduciary duty, is equally responsible for ensuring the organization has access to adequate financial resources. And so when we think about something like a treasurer, it is not so much as the person who is in charge of financial oversight per se, but who is involved in more detail with more regularity in financial oversight, both in board meetings as well as in finance committee meetings usually, and in direct communication with senior management, both in order to make sure that there is, really regular, consistent oversight between board meetings, but also I think to serve as a facilitator between the various bodies that are doing financial management and oversight tasks. So management, the finance committee, the board as a whole, right? To be able to sort of spearhead analysis and synthesis of information, to be able to bring it to the finance committee for effective discussion, and then in a more condensed form, to bring to the board for periodic reporting, but also voting on any kinds of policies or major financial strategic decisions that have to be made. So in that way, I see sort of the board treasurer as being kind of the governance linchpin when it comes to matters of financial oversight.
That's great. Thank you so much. Now, all of us being introduced, Barbara introducing me, and of course, mentioned CPA, and then Phil and Carl, and talking about our financial background that we have. Carl, I was wondering if you would give us your insight as to how much financial background do you think that a treasurer needs to have, or should someone who perhaps doesn't have the credentials, what do you think is most important for them to have in place to be able to serve in that capacity?
Great question. Thanks, Sarah, because, boards come in and organizations come in all sizes. So, obviously, I think the more sophisticated and large the not-for-profit, the more important it is to have somebody serving in the treasurer role that has expertise in finances. Really important, what's a treasurer do? Making sure that the financial information and the financial, systems are intact at the organization, as Phil said, so that the board is aware of exactly, where the organization is at financially and has the systems in place that things are reported to the board, in a timely manner and an accurate manner for, good decision making. So obviously, if you're, looking, you're with an organization that's looking for a treasurer, or you're considering a role as a treasurer, I mean, the organization would do well, obviously, to find somebody who has the most financial experience they can find, because there'll be a wealth of knowledge about, many different things that, will be important to the organization to fulfilling its mission. Again, I've seen many examples, particularly with smaller organizations, where the treasurer doesn't have a lot of experience. Again, sometimes that is the case, and folks can fulfill the role in a perfectly, competent manner, but it just means as questions come up, as issues come up, it's a little bit more work to talk to somebody with the level of financial expertise needed to, answer the questions or get the information the organization needs to go forward. So, pretty high on the important list. I think in general, if you're with an organization looking for a treasurer, you want to really put a lot of emphasis on trying to find somebody with some financial expertise, if at all possible. It's only going to benefit the organization and ultimately, cost the organization less money, because you will have that financial expertise in-house versus, having to go to, different outside organizations to get the expertise you might need to answer questions and, make sure the organization is, complying with all they need to comply with, from a financial and business operations perspective.
Thank you, Carl. I think that's an excellent point, and a great segue into the next question that I have. And I'll start this one with Phil, but then Carl will ask you to also provide some of your experience, because you had mentioned the different sizes of boards and organizations that we all have served before. Phil, could you talk to us about what you envision to be successful in the treasurer role? What your relationship with the officers of the organization should be, perhaps what you've observed that relationship to be most successful, both with either the executive director or the president of the organization, as well as the key financial or accounting staff?
Yeah, so, I think that the tough thing is that I'm not sure there's a one-size-fits-all answer for this, just because nonprofits of varying sizes, nonprofits that are sort of longstanding institutions versus new startups are going to have such different fiscal infrastructure, right? And so I think that if you're talking about an organization that has an annual budget of a couple $100,000 and, maybe only has one, staff person, right? One full-time staff person and a, contracted bookkeeper or something like that. I think the sets of relationships that you're going to have and how you divide up financial responsibilities is going to be very, very different from, a multi-million-dollar, nonprofit institution with a whole fiscal department, right? I think that overall, you want to think about division of responsibility so that board members are focused mostly on oversight, governance, policy, strategy, right? A high level view of where the organization is. And that's true on a lot of fronts, but it is true in finance as one place, right? And where staff management generally is responsible for execution, for operations on a day-to-day basis, for reporting, generally speaking. And so I think that, you want to make sure that the relationship between the treasurer and the senior management team is one that strikes a balance between not being, so regularly involved that you're stepping on each other's toes, right? I think that can oftentimes be a problem where there's some overstep from the board or from the finance committee or the treasurer into the sort of day-to-day business operations or business decisions of the nonprofit, and that can lead to, I think both confusion and inefficiency and conflict about who's responsible for what. So that's on the one hand, you don't want to go down that road, but also you don't want to be so laissez-faire that you're sort of rubber stamping every decision that the management team makes, or not being sort of critically engaged in the financial performance of the organization on a regular basis. I think that the relationship between the treasurer and the executive in particular, assuming that there is one, is critical to have regular communication there. And I think specifically regular communication in advance of the committee meetings or the board meetings where there's going to be financial discussion, right? Like the treasurer and the executive should be key partners in preparing to make sure that those meetings happen effectively, right? That it's clear about what the agenda is supposed to be. What are we looking to get out of this meeting in terms of decisions or recommendations to the board or what have you? If the organization has, in-house fiscal staff, or even, I suppose, really, an outsourced controller, outsourced accountant, there can be, I think, direct line of communication between those folks and the board treasurer for purposes of like fine-tuning report presentation and stuff like that. I think it's important to be cautious that you don't have a line of communication between fiscal staff and the board treasurer that effectively cuts the executive out of, key conversations about key decisions or performance or what have you. Like the executive function is such that that person needs to be sort of at the center of all of those discussions, at least, periodically, right? So I guess that's what I would say about, managing that relationship. And then between the treasurer and the, and the other members of the board or the other board officers, I think, again, it's a question of the treasurer being able to synthesize and condense the, somewhat sometimes complicated and intricate world of nonprofit finance into a series of messages that they can communicate to the larger board so that the larger board can understand where the organization is financially, can do their, can fulfill their fiduciary duty in that way and help to sort of vote on, major financial decisions and so forth. But recognizing that not everyone on the board has the capacity to go as far in depth as the treasurer will on, combing through the data and so forth, doing the analysis. So I guess that would sort of be my general, overview on how those relationships could come together. The other thing I do want to say, just in relation to the financial expertise question that you asked, Carl, a moment ago, I think it's important to recognize that there are a whole different set of kinds of financial expertise, within the nonprofit sector, right? That, sometimes overlap a bit and sometimes not, right? And so when we talk about needing someone who has some amount of financial expertise to fill the treasurer role, especially for a larger and more complicated organization, I fully agree with that. I think you can look to a number of different types of expertise that person could have. One of them might be, for example, accounting expertise, like, you might be looking for a CPA, right? And that's one kind of valuable type of expertise. But another one might just be nonprofit financial management expertise that includes financial elements to it, right? So somebody who serves, I don't know, as the executive director or program director of a nonprofit where they had substantial budget authority and, were involved in monitoring the performance of the financial performance of the nonprofit. That person may not technically be a finance professional, right? But may have material financial expertise to be able to bring to the treasurer role. for an organization that is, not significantly more financially complicated than the one where they have served, right? And I think the other thing to keep an eye out for is taking a close look at how financial expertise from the for-profit sector, banking, investments, how that type of expertise does and does not translate to a nonprofit treasurer role. There are some pieces of that expertise that may be very valuable, and others that are not going to translate perfectly. And so I think that's an important conversation to have.
Okay, thank you. And Carl, I wonder if you could kind of piggyback and expand upon a scenario that Phil had just mentioned when we were talking about those roles, mostly because you had mentioned in your intro some firms that it is outsourced CFO or an outsourced controller position. And maybe you have some tips and tricks or just best practices to share with us about how a treasurer can be successful when you have this outsourced function in place of having it be internal staff of the nonprofit.
Yeah, and that's really a great option for some of the smaller not-for-profits. If you need, your level of need for, financial staff, is less than is only part-time. You might be able to, by considering outside firms that provide accounting services, you might be able to get a higher level of expertise, but only pay for, the time that your organization needs, from a finance professional. Whereas if you're hiring a part-time bookkeeper, for example, you could get somebody who's really good at the job and does an excellent job. You can get somebody that, maybe does not have as much experience or expertise, and the organization will struggle based on the limitations of that person. So, going with an outside firm, you typically will get a higher level of expertise. Again, you're only paying for the time that you need it. Great example, I'm the treasurer of a board that's a small organization. They have no internal accounting staff. They hire a firm that comes in, 2-3 hours a month that, prepares their financial statements. And once a year, they hire an outside firm to do a review of their books. And, it works out great. They're getting a, great service from these different organizations, again, without paying for a full-time staff member, which they don't need for the size of the organization, that they are. So it really is a great option for smaller not-for-profits to really take a look at and consider. The goal of any not-for-profit is obviously you want to have the level of financial expertise and spend the time that you need to present accurate information and timely information to the board so that they can make the best decisions possible based on good information. I mean, that's the whole goal. Phil had talked a little bit about that. So, considering, outside agencies, great option for smaller not-for-profits, and something if folks hadn't, and there's many firms that do that type of work. So it'd be great to, for folks that are in that situation, there's plenty of options out there to consider.
Thank you so much, Carl. So I did hear mention of a budget. So I'm going to turn it over to see between Phil or Carl, if one of you would like to kick off that discussion, talking about, involvement in the budget process. And I do understand there's no one size fits all because it's going to depend organization by organization. But it looks like Phil, you want to get us started on the budget conversation?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's maybe kind of two pieces to it, right? One is a process, discussion, and then the other is sort of, what should the product be, right? The budget itself, and I tend to think that the budget process should be one that for most organizations is spearheaded by senior management, right? That they are involved in the generation of the budget draft, and that then there are sort of iterations of review that reach a broader set of the governing body, right? So I would think that the treasurer would be sort of the first line there, right? Where the senior management team, the executive or CFO or whoever it is that you have, has an initial review of the budget draft with the treasurer, so that the treasurer can sort of provide initial feedback, before that budget draft then goes to the finance committee for robust discussion and perhaps revision, and then ultimately the finance committee will recommend the draft budget to the board for approval, and you'll have some amount of high-level discussion of the budget at the board level. But I think once it gets there, right, the finance committee, and in particular the finance chair, which is often the treasurer in my experience, is going to be the one who is leading, or at least co-leading with the executive, the presentation of the budget, to say we've worked together to develop a financial strategy for the organization for the next year. It is represented here in the budget, and we think this is a viable path forward for the organization, so that both the executive and the treasurer are then presenting that information to the full board. And then when it comes to what the budget should be, right, I think that it is important that all the folks involved in producing the budget have a sort of similar paradigm, if you will, of like how the budget connects to the nonprofit's financial health, both short and long term. And so a number of things that you want to be addressing there, right, is that the budget should be reasonably conservative, right? Doesn't mean it's a sort of worst case scenario budget that you should be passing, but one that I generally say is more likely to have good surprises than bad surprises throughout the course of the year, right? Because the good surprises are much easier to correct for than the bad ones. In that way, the budget should be, grounded in historical precedent and, clear ideas about why things are changing and how. You might also have a plan B budget if there's a lot of risk that, you're facing a lot of financial risk in the next year. Not everyone has to do that. The budget should ideally be aiming to produce a surplus, right? I think there's a lot of the nonprofit sector culture that aims for a zero break-even budget. That's not a great policy, right? To aim for break even, because it is budget surpluses that are able to build the organization's balance sheet health and provide some cushion to protect you from risk, to allow the organization to pursue new programmatic opportunities or hire, pay the sort of short-term costs of bringing new people and new staff in the door, what have you. Building up reserves is what allows you to do that, and surpluses are what generally produce reserves over time, right? So aiming for some amount of reasonable surplus.
Now,
yeah.
Phil, you just hit on one of those myths, right? It's a nonprofit. Doesn't that mean they're not supposed to have a profit?
Yeah, not true. Nonprofits absolutely should be aiming for profits, right? And it is not profits in the same way as some for-profit businesses or for-profit corporations might be producing surpluses. You're never going to be, distributing that money back to shareholders or things like that. But you are going to be building the financial health of the organization so that you can continue to serve your community, not just this year, but well into the future, right? And I think that is an approach that is gaining traction in the nonprofit sector, but is perhaps not, universally accepted. And as a result, I think you have a lot of organizations, I would argue perhaps the majority of the nonprofit sector is undercapitalized and sort of living, hand to mouth a lot of the time, right? Not everybody, but very common. And then the last thing I would say just about sort of the budget product is that alongside the quantitative budget, right, all of the numbers that lay out how much revenue from what sources and expenses and so forth, I always recommend that the team that is producing the budget produce a prose document, short, just a page, right? Bullet points that explains not, here's how much our total revenue is. You see that already, it's in the budget, but the why or the so what of the story, right? To say, here are the things you as the board, when you're discussing the budget for approval, here's what you should be paying attention to. Here are the major risks, the major opportunities. Here is how our programmatic direction that we are intending for the year is being reflected in this set of numbers, et cetera. And I think that can help folks who are maybe not as comfortable with finance understand here is what we are committing to when we approve this budget.
That's great. Thank you, Phil. And Carl, we have a couple of questions that are in line coming through the chat right now with talking about the budget. So there's a question about if you have a particular format that you think works best. So some of the questions are, should this resemble the internal financial statements where it would be a balance sheet plus a profit and loss statement? Or do you find it more useful just to focus on something that's generated or maintained in a spreadsheet? So maybe if you have any thoughts about what you have found to be most helpful.
I think it's very helpful for the budget to be in a similar format to the financial statements that excuse me, the board is seeing on a regular basis. So then they're quickly able to zero in on maybe changes from the current year's operations. Typically when I prepare budgets, I'll compare it to the current year and where we're projected to end the year. That's always very useful. And to see like the numbers that we're projecting for the budget for the coming year, how they line up with how we're currently operating. And you want to have getting back to our earlier conversation, the board and the treasurer are really operating at a strategic level for the organization. While they're not involved in the nuts and bolts of putting together the budget or producing the budget, their role is to really look at the budget, look at the strategic direction of the organization, and really be another set of eyes and ears, and offer advice to the executive director in really the future direction of the organization and what the implications are financially. As Phil had said, a not-for-profit organization, they should be striving to run, their organization such that they produce a positive bottom line. That's not the mission of the organization, but if you have no margin, you have no, you do not have the funds to fulfill the mission, whatever that mission might be. So very important to keep that in mind. So with, very sound, strategic financial direction, it allows the organization to better fulfill, their mission, which is ultimately, the treasurer's and the board's responsibility together. So, so I would, my advice, for budgets, keep it in a format that's, similar to the financial statements you see every month. And the format should be in, should recognize the level that the board is looking at. You're not going to see a detail with all the accounts of the organization. It would be a lot harder for, the average board member to drill down and really get an understanding. You want it to be summarized in such a way that the board and the treasurer can see the big picture. And certainly if there's questions, they can drill down with either the, the finance staff of the organization or the executive director. But you want it to be, in a format that's reflective of the strategic look, that the treasurer and the board will be taking, with the organization.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some challenges, especially given some of the new accounting standards that have been released that do directly impact nonprofit organizations in the timing of recognition of certain contributions that they have received. historically perhaps multi-year funds that have an organization was allowed some discretion as to whether or not that would be recognized at the time that the award was received, or if they would just recognize as those multi-year payments are made, say perhaps payments from a private foundation. And then also understanding, the specifics with government grants and just the challenges that I have noticed, especially with smaller organizations, is how to explain that how to incorporate that into your budget. So if you had recognized a multi-year award, a 5-year award from a private foundation in the year that the award is received, I'll try not to get too technical here. But if that's what how the accounting guidance says you need to recognize the revenue, how do you go into year number 2, knowing that you're going to receive that payment, or you should receive that payment from that private foundation, but it's not going to be revenue to you this year? So do you have any advice or other scenarios that you've noticed that nonprofit boards can potentially struggle with on how to present that budget? Especially, Phil, we talked about building that surplus. Well, wow, if we build that budget knowing we're going to get a 5-year award in the current year, right, that's going to look great on paper. But how do we deal with that in reality moving forward?
Yeah, so I want to recognize here that I am not a CPA, and so on the sort of account, on the technical side of revenue recognition and how these new standards impact your ability to recognize multi-year funding, I don't want to weigh in on that. But I do want to weigh in on the second piece in terms of how should the board think about profitability, and what should the information that the board sees look like in reflecting those kind of dynamics. And here I think that it is important to recognize that financial information can be structured for sort of compliance purposes, right? Ensuring that your accounting system is, compliant with, GAAP accrual, right, methodology, that sort of is provided to your auditor and whoever else you're reporting to, right? On the one hand, you can also certainly internally present financial information in a way that is adjusted to show a more real world, financial sustainability picture for your organization. And I very much encourage folks when they are doing budgeting or even, reviewing periodic financial reporting to sort of make those sort of adjustments to their internal documentation in a way that's transparent, right? Annotated so that you can see, hey, here's what we've done. Here's how it differs from what you see in the accounting system, so that you can understand whether the revenue that you're seeing in your report is truly available for the organization's use in that period. Because exactly as you said, if you get a multi-year funding commitment where you recognize all of the revenue, restricted though a large portion of it may be, in year 1, and that may be the way that you need to record that in your accounting system, and certainly you should do so. But there needs to be some place where the board is seeing, we don't actually have a $500,000 surplus this year, right? Because a big chunk of this money must be held over for future years. And so I think when you are doing budgeting, it is really critical to focus in on reflecting all of your expenses for this year against revenue truly available for you in this period. And that might be, year 1, only year 1 of the 3-year grant that you're recognizing this year. But it might also be, funds that were recognized in your accounting system on a restricted basis in a prior year that are this year being released for use, right? You might be in year 3 of that cycle we just described, and your accounting system is not going to show possibly, more revenue recognition this year, but there is a chunk of money that's available for you to spend. And so, I think being able to manage that dynamic in a way that gives the board the insight that they need into the funds truly available for use this year, while not in any way sort of undermining the GAAP appropriateness of your accounting data in and of itself, right, is a balance that organizations need to figure out how to achieve.
Thank you. And I think that supports Carl's comments about the presentation of the budget. So it should resemble the financial information that you have internally, but then as you had mentioned, Phil, with just having those bullets of what's important with a budget. But Carl, I think you had something to add on to that. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, great. Great information, and a great way of describing kind of your gap financial statements, maybe from differences on your internal financial statements that might be important for the the board and the treasurer to understand. One of the things, so a budget, just in big picture terms, why do we budget? A budget is a plan. It's a financial plan for the organization, a financial roadmap. I always joke with the teams I've worked with over the years, as soon as the budget's produced and the ink is dry on the budget, it's out of date, because obviously new information keeps coming to light, and that will change, some things that are in the budget. But the plan is so important to have that guiding star for the organization. One of the things that I've done at many of the organizations I've been involved with is beyond the 1-year plan. And this is really getting to what Sarah and Phil had mentioned. Maybe you got a big grant that's really gonna, you're really gonna use over the next 5 years. We would take the budgeting process a step further and also do a projection for the next 5 years. So what that does, and again, the further out you get, kind of the less accurate it's going to get, because you're making assumptions, as to what's going to happen in the future. But this allows the treasurer and the board to really have a broader vision for the future for the organization. And if there's issues, such as, oh, you know what, this grant is going to serve us for the next 5 years, we're going to be well and good. Laying the revenues and expenses out and just making an assessment of, yep, we're on the track we want to be on, is, a great thing to, to be aware of. Conversely, if there's going to be issues, maybe 3 years out or 4 years out, the board and, the organization can take a strategic look at what they can do to address those concerns before you're, essentially, pushing all the red ink, essentially having trouble. So, very important to, while it's important to do a budget every year, and you have to do a budget every year to have that financial plan, also very helpful to look out beyond a year to, the future and what the goals are of the organizations and what the financial implications are, so that the board can really, do their important job of setting the strategic direction, for the organization, and making the important decisions they need to make to really assure the financial sustainability of, both the organization and the mission of the organization, as you look forward. So just I think a very useful tool for organizations that if they don't do this, to, consider that.
That's great. Thank you. And what I love that both of you are doing is that you're really making a clear line. Some of the words that I heard at the beginning is our role is overseers. So it's oversight, it's governance, and it's strategy, and trying not to get into the weeds, right? To micromanage our organizations, because generally our boards are volunteers. And if an organization is looking for someone to really run it as volunteers, we may not have the time that's necessary to go into that. But we do have one of the questions that came up from our panel, and they're wondering if either of you have had experience when trying to present a budget and working with an executive director or a president of an organization that has very limited financial understanding. So some of the things that I think could be happening here, perhaps their involvement in a budgeting process isn't realistic. Trying to explain some of those nuances that the two of you had mentioned between strategy for surplus building, doing a projection looking more than 1 year out. So I will just turn it over to see if someone unmutes first to address that question.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that ideally, right, recognizing that folks come into executive roles from a lot of different directions, that also, and that often, right, they're folks that came up through program. Not always, but like folks who have a deep understanding of the mission, of the community, perhaps of the funding sources and so forth. And so may not come into that role with like nonprofit financial management experience. And that can be fine, but I do think that understanding the financial health of the organization and being an active participant in budgeting and other parts of financial planning is a necessary part of the executive role, I would say. And so I don't think that the answer is just to say, well, our executive is not really a finance person, we're going to work around them, to do budgeting or what have you. I think that really sort of cuts out a meaningful portion of what the executive role has to be. And so I think that the answer instead should be, what is the support system that our executive needs in order to have them take on that aspect of the role? And that could be a few different things, right? It could be the fiscal staff, whether internal or outsourced, working with the executive to help train them up on budgeting and financial management matters. It could be the treasurer or members of the finance committee doing the same. It could be accessing trainings, whether it's Camp Finance, Nikon's Camp Finance, for example, right? Or sort of other one-on-one coaching or training opportunities, to get that person to a level where they are comfortable dealing with that information. And that does not mean that your executive has to become an accountant in some way, or be able to do the bookkeeping or your bank reconciliations or something, right? No, it just means that when you have matters of monitoring the financial health of the organization, understanding or being able to project the potential financial impact of major programmatic decisions, or can we afford to bring on this new hire or whatever it is, that your executive is able to make a data-informed, decision or present some data-informed analysis to other, members of the management and oversight team, so that you can figure out what the right thing to do is.
I'll just jump on to what Phil had said, and it's important to keep in your mind that, as Phil said, that executive directors have different levels of financial abilities. They're ultimately responsible for the organization, the operation of the organization. So the finance team will put together the budget and the financial statements, but ultimately the executive director is responsible for executing on that financial plan and reporting how things are going. Yeah, we're on track. No, we're off track in this area, as we as the organization moves forward. So important to keep in mind. And as Phil said, you'll have executive directors that have a high level of financial acumen. You'll have executive directors who maybe do not have that high level of financial acumen. But the finance team's goal, whether that's an outside consultant, whether that's somebody on staff, is to give the executive directors the tools that he or she needs, to know where the organization's at, make informed decisions, going forward, and to present, those options to, those issues and options and variances, to the board. Again, the board will operate at a higher level, not a day-to-day operation, but on a strategic level, and obviously advise the executive director on, changes the organization might need to make, going forward. So, but, we've all, I know I've seen executive directors at all different levels, and just because they might not, be an accountant, so to say, they can obviously be very effective with the right tools they need to do their job.
That's great. Thank you. And so now I'm seeing some more questions come in. I've been trying to incorporate them just into our overall conversation. But I believe that we are good now with the budgeting conversation. And I'm going to try to address this one that came in. And I think some of these is just more of our overall experience with nonprofit organizations, whether it would be working for one, capacity with consulting with one, or just our experience with boards. But kind of along with your comments, Phil, that you had about organizations and that really having a goal of surpluses so that you have reserves, understanding, perhaps you're dependent upon in part on investments. But what about your, Carl and Phil, your experience with organizations that are primarily funded through reimbursable grants? So obviously you need to have some money in advance, whether that comes from an outsourced financing role, maybe some existing surplus or startup money that you had with the organization. But when really you're just getting reimbursed dollar for dollar that you're spending, do you have any suggestions of how an organization could be more strategic in trying to develop or grow a surplus?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, just like it's tough, right? This is sort of the central question that, quite a lot, perhaps the majority of the work that I do in my career is to try to answer that question. So I don't think there are necessarily easy answers for an organization, that is working primarily with very regimented, reimbursement-based grants. Often, government funding works like that, right? It is, indeed more difficult to achieve a surplus. Some organizations will turn, I think the overall answer, right, is that you want to find some sort of supplemental, unrestricted revenue stream that allows you to get in surplus dollars that don't have to be spent in very particular ways during that period. The answer for many organizations on that front is going to be individual giving, right? But how much of a market you have for that is going to depend very much on the kind of work you do and the networks you have access to and so forth. There may be other places that you can turn, besides individual giving, general operating support grants or something like that. In some cases, yes, in investment income, endowment draw, although I think that for most organizations, if you don't already have an endowment in place that's throwing money off, the prospect of building one, if you don't have even the fundraising capacity to do unrestricted annual giving, it's probably a bit of a remote possibility. So I would say, probably annual fund type, fundraising would be the first place to look. But in general, the concept would be, trying to cultivate, supplemental unrestricted revenue sources, even if they don't end up being a huge percent of your budget, right? Your overall revenue budget for the year, if they're money that comes in the door without strings, it can go towards an annual surplus.
Yeah, and I'll jump on what Phil was saying, that just like if you've got a personal investment portfolio and you've only invested in one stock, if the stock does well, you're going to make money. If the stock does not do well, all your eggs are in one basket. You're not going to be in a good situation. From a not-for-profits perspective, you want to diversify your sources of revenue as much as possible. And I understand what you're saying. There's not-for-profits that many that have like one primary grant. That's really where the board can be helpful in really pointing the direction and kind of setting a direction for the future for the organization, to really diversify. And many organizations, I've actually spent in my career, it's been about half of my 34 years have been in finance. Half has been as the executive director of a fundraising foundation. There's huge potential on the fundraising side. Many times the not-for-profit, whatever they're doing, there's people in the community that identify with that and want to help support that. And the organization really would serve its mission well to either get some advice or get somebody on board that can help bring them in that direction. And as Phil said, you start out walking before you run. You're going to start out with small programs. You might start out with events, again, to begin to bring, money in the door, but the potential is really, limitless, quite frankly. But it does take, time, energy, and money dedicated to, fundraising, to, raise dollars. But it really is an important option that many organizations should really seriously consider in order to diversify their income sources.
Thank you so much to both of you. So I'm just going to go ahead and say that I think we're going to see Barbara any second now, because we only have 5 minutes left. I can't believe that this hour has gone by so quickly. There's a question that came up that's is something that we maybe have touched a little bit on, but not specifically. So I'm going to go ahead and ask that. Do you have suggestions for a new organization, no paid staff yet? What should they do with their board?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, I talked a lot earlier. I think we've all talked a lot earlier about trying to maintain an appropriate division between sort of management responsibilities and board responsibilities. If you have no staff, that division probably doesn't really exist. And so you will have, in my experience, board members doing the ongoing operational tasks. Perhaps you still have an outsourced bookkeeper, unless someone on the board is, has that experience, so that you're maintaining, appropriate financial records, which even if you don't have paid staff, you should be doing. I think that my primary recommendation for circumstances like that is to have explicit, documented practice, policies and procedures, right, that say who is responsible for doing what. Because I think that the biggest pitfall for sort of informal, or volunteer-based management of a nonprofit institution is when you have confusion about, like, oh, I thought this person was supposed to be, managing the, petty cash or whatever it is, right? And you find out that nobody's doing it, right? And I think documented policies and procedures are the place to start.
All right, we have 3 minutes left. Sarah, any concluding thoughts before I thank everybody for coming? Oops.
I would turn it over to Carl if you wanted to take just a minute or two just to add to Phil's commentary on that question that we had from our audience.
Sure, Sarah. Yeah, because and what Phil touched upon, I'll just expand just briefly on that. When you have volunteer staff, again, you have a situation where you have folks that aren't professionals, or this is not what they do for a living. The potential for things to get off track are real. And having just controls, having if it's a critical function, have 2 people do the function together, as a sort of control. But I guess thinking through that so that not one person has all responsibility for all the banking, for example, or things like that is critically important. Because how many times have we all heard the news stories? Oh, Carl was such a nice person. I can't believe he absconded with all that money. You obviously want to avoid situations like that, setting up your systems to really have controls in place from the start. Particularly important when you have a small organization that is run by, volunteer board members, when they're actually hands-on, doing the work. So just something to consider.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you to all of you for spending what I would anticipate as your lunch hour with us, but we wanted to be very mindful of your time and make sure that we kept it to that 1 hour, so we weren't delaying your day anymore. But again, thank you. Thank you, Barbara, for the opportunity for letting us be part of this great conversation. And again, thank you to all of you for what you do for our nonprofit community. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.